This is utter tripe. Now I may do this just as like a little side note or addenda footnote to the Freud series. Here's a student of Freud, a person who studied under Freud and was later prominent in the 60s and 70s in America. Alright, so that was what science took on the mask of, was Freudianism. In 1922, before a rapt Berlin audience, Freud introduced the theory which many of his followers regarded as the intellectual discovery of their era, his tripartite analysis of the human personality. Now, we've just looked through just the first 20 or 30, the first 30 pages of, let's see, yeah, here it is. The first 30 pages of his case on Dora, which he wrote in 1900 and published in 1905. So, we're talking here about something that he wrote about 20 years later, after the case that we've just sampled. So imagine, given 20 years and no rationality, how much crazier and more complex and bizarre and how much more jargon will a system have, you know? According to this theory, the prime mover, and you can ask yourself whether this seems true from what we've already read from Freud, the prime mover in human nature is an unperceivable entity with a will and purpose of its own, the unconscious. Right? Because, I mean, doesn't that fit pretty well with what we've gotten from Dora? I don't need to go over it. The unconscious, quote, is basically an id, I-D. I.e., it is a contradictory, non-moral it, seething with innate, bestial, primeval, inherited, imperiously insistent cravings or instincts. In deadly combat with this element is man's conscience or superego, which consists essentially not of reasoned moral convictions, but of primitive, illogical, largely unconscious taboos or categorical imperatives, representing the mores of the child's parents, therefore ultimately society. Now, doesn't this sound exactly like what we were getting in the Dora case? And the random injunctions of this individual, unquestionably, the random injunctions injected or introjected into the individual cowers before these. An individual cannot overcome what the id does. The individual's not in control at the base of your mind, behind reason, before reason, in dominance over reason. The root of reason is irrationality. This is Freud. As this theory makes eloquently clear, Freud's view of reason is fundamentally Kantian. Enter Immanuel Kant, just to save the day. Both men hold that human thought is ultimately governed not by man's awareness of external fact, but by internal mental elements independent of such fact. Right? That's the a priori stuff for Kant, and for Freud it's just your mind seething against itself and hating its feces and stuff like that. Both see the basic task of the mind not as perception, but as creation. Right? With Kant, you don't perceive reality, you create or invent reality as you go. The creation of a subjective world in compliance with the requirements of innate or introduced mental structures. Whereas Kant, however, draws on the concepts of 18th century Enlightenment philosophy to define his categories. Right? He had to draw from maybe he took the very worst of what was available at the time, but he had to take what was available at the time, which was the Enlightenment. So he takes that and he strives to defend them as inherent pure reason, right? Kant didn't say, everything's irrational, everything's insane. Kant said, this is really what's reasonable. To hell with what you call reason from the senses. I'm talking about reason before the senses. Or without the senses, or beyond the senses or something. So he didn't abandon reason. He said, this is the real reason. But what does Freud do? Quote, Freud derives his key structures from 19th century Romanticist philosophy and flaunts their irrational, anti-rational character. In regard to method, the basic novelty of this psychological variant of the Kantian viewpoint lies in the Freudians' claim that their theories are a product not of prior philosophizing, but of scientific investigation based on clinical data. Right? That's what the Freudians say. Kant said, I sat in my chair and figured this out. The Freudians say, we studied humans and we read Freud's essays, and now we can just do this scientific stuff with the mind, figure out the mind. Judging by their methodological practice, scientific investigation for the Freudians consists in leaping from random observations to sweeping constructs devoid of evidential justification. They don't need evidence. Remember, a prioritizing on evidence or focusing on evidence or whatever is irrational. Sticking to one way of thinking, one course, is irrational, even if what you're sticking to is rationality. So, they do these sweeping constructions devoid of evidential justification, rational or empirical. Like Kant would at least give justification that was, it wasn't tied to the senses, but it was at least a bunch of verbose. He tried to get you to believe it, but they just throw that away and they just leap straight to a construct, bizarre construct. And then in declaring that these constructs are compatible with any factual data of any kind and are therefore irrefutable. Right? That is what Freud said. He said, I've found these three categories of mind, these three things in every single case of hysteria that I've investigated. And I'd bother it to look up what the three were. But they are based on interpretation, quote, without any factual data of any kind, and are therefore irrefutable. For example, here's two examples. If one finds no sign of an Oedipus complex, then it has been repressed. Right? Anything that you find not in the mind has that or has done that and has pushed it under. We saw straight through all that earlier, yeah. If one finds evidence contradicting the Oedipus complex, there has been a reaction formation. Right. Yep. Now we skip a paragraph. Now some people were outraged. He was very popular in Germany, but even some people in Germany were outraged, and some people around the world were outraged. Quote, the real root of the outrage his own doctrines provoked, Freud says with certain pride, is their assault on the self-love of humanity. He says this is what people really hated, is that I assaulted the self-love of humans. Quote, whatever the wounds that men have suffered from earlier scientific theories, he explains, the blow of psychoanalysis, quote, here's Freud's word, is probably the most wounding. So science may have attacked man in many ways over the years, but psychoanalysis is the biggest, most vicious attack of science. The blow, he states, the hit that it gave, is the idea that man is not supreme in his own soul, that the ego is not the master in its own house. Okay? That is a pretty profound comment if you say man's ego is a construct of repression in the back of his mind, and the things that come out as his ego, what he is, what man defines himself as, is a product of reversing against things he desires. Man desires one thing, but he fights against it. And that is the product of what we are. That's what humans are, is fighting against what they desire. So if you want to rape your mom, mold your feces, etc., you fight against that, and that is what turns out as you. These formulations, while eloquent, the ones not what I gave, but what Freud gave. These formulations, while eloquent, are too generalized to capture fully the essence of Freud's wound. Freud did not originate determinism, or irrationalism, or collectivism, or the theory of original sin, although he certainly used that, didn't he? Or cynicism, or pessimism, or even the idea of the unconscious. Now, I've heard that Freud did originate the idea of the unconscious, and Peikoff doesn't say